The head of 911 called me boss. I know it sounds unbelievable, especially since I was sitting there, handcuffed, being detained by his own officers. It all started because this out-of-control HOA Karen dialed 911, claiming I was trespassing in what was actually my own office space. She demanded I leave, and when I didn't jump at her orders, she thought she was about to crush some broke repair guy who dared to challenge her authority. What she didn't realize, though, was that she had just made the worst mistake of her life. That call she thought would be her triumph, yeah, it ended up being the reason for her downfall. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to deal with a power-tripping Karen like her. So here's how it all began. When I first arrived in Maplewood driving a rusty old Civic, I had no clue I was about to cross paths with the most delusional woman I'd ever meet. Name's Marcus Blake. You could call me a professional observer. I work with the government investigating abuse of emergency services, specifically 911 misuse. But nobody in Maplewood knew that, as far as they were concerned, I was just another broke handyman hustling to survive. It was the perfect disguise. I had the whole beat-up car, clearance rack wardrobe, and cheap takeout lunches. I even made sure my overdue utility bills were visible. Sometimes, to expose the rotten at the top, you've got to blend in at the bottom. I'd actually been working this case for months before setting foot in Maplewood. Victoria Hamilton, the HOA president ruling over this suburban empire, had made 67 emergency calls in just 8 months. That's not just unusual, it's suspicious. Most folks might go years without calling 911. But Victoria treated it like a private concierge service. My mission? Figure out why her calls always got lightning-fast responses, while other locals were left waiting. Something in Maplewood stunk, and it wasn't just the trash bins. Several residents had already filed complaints about unfair treatment and sketchy emergency response patterns. That's when the state brought me in. I rented a tiny office space inside the community center and told everyone I was a city assessor working on property reports. Boring enough to avoid too much interest, but official enough to justify my presence. The community center itself was a sad little box of beige walls and bad lighting. The overhead fluorescents buzzed constantly. The carpet was older than some of the residents, and the furniture looked like it had been salvaged from a correctional facility. Still, it was perfect for what I needed. A front row seat to observe the residents and especially Victoria Hamilton in their natural environment. Watching her operate was like watching a peacock pretending to be a lion. She'd sweep through the place in her flashy outfits, snapping orders at anyone within range, convinced she was in charge of everything and everyone. The people around her, they moved like she was radioactive. Adults avoided her. Kids stopped playing the second her Mercedes rolled up. It was like the whole neighborhood had been psychologically hijacked. Things got interesting on the third day. Really interesting. I'd planted a few evidence pieces to back up my poor handyman personnel, like a thrift store receipt for a $5 shirt, some instant noodles, and a red stamped overdue utility bill. And wouldn't you know it, Victoria found them during one of her infamous morning inspections. That's right, she had keys to every shared space in the community and patrolled them like a military officer doing rounds. She claimed it was part of her oversight duties, but really, it was about controlling everything within Maplewood's borders. When she saw my stuff, her expression changed completely. She froze, her hands trembled, her breathing shifted, and she just stood there, staring at that utility bill like it was a snake. I didn't realize it at the time, but I had just hit a raw nerve buried deep in her past. You see, what the folks in Maplewood didn't know was that their beloved HOA Queen wasn't born into power. Before she became Victoria Hamilton, she was Linda Walker, a struggling single mom living in a trailer park, barely getting by on government aid and food stamps. But that's a backstory we'll get into later. For now, all I knew was that my carefully crafted Poverty Act had stirred something dark inside her. By day 5, the mask came all the way off. It was about 6 p.m. I was sitting in the office, tapping away at some fake property reports to maintain my cover, when Victoria kicked in the door like she was raiding a drug den. Her face was flushed, her voice unsteady, and she pointed at me like I'd just insulted her entire ancestry. "You don't belong here," she shouted so loudly, I'm sure half the neighborhood heard her. This place is for respectable people. And the way she spat out respectable, it was dripping with contempt. I knew then this wasn't about an office or a rental contract. This was about pride, ego, and some very deep insecurities. She went on. Your poverty is dragging down our property values. I almost laughed. Lady, if you only knew what I really do for a living, you'd be begging me to stay. But I stayed in character, just a quiet, working man trying to make ends meet. Ma'am, I've got a legal rental agreement, I replied calmly. I'm not going anywhere. I pay my rent like everyone else. That's when she really snapped. I am the HOA president, she shrieked, her voice shooting into a range that probably disturbed dogs for miles. When I say leave you leave. The entitlement was wild, but I looked her dead in the eye and said, no, ma'am, I'm staying right here. This is my lawful workspace. She looked like she was about to pass out. She was trembling with fury, and for a second, I genuinely considered calling for medical help. Her face cycled through 5 different shades of red, her fists clenched tight, and she started making these strange, shallow gasps like she couldn't breathe properly. Then, without warning, she turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her so hard the entire building shuddered, probably breaking a few local noise laws in the process. I watched her through the window as she marched across the parking lot, yanked out her phone, and started furiously tapping at the screen. Even from that distance, I could see her flailing her arms, no doubt trending to someone about the drifter who dared to set foot in her sacred community center. What she didn't realize was that she'd just handed me exactly what I needed: a solid evidence that this woman had a deep-seated obsession with control and a disturbing level of disdain for anyone she viewed as socially beneath her. Not long after she stormed off, there was a knock at my office door. Standing there was Tony Vasquez, a longtime Maplewood resident who looked like he'd seen more HOA drama than most people see in a lifetime. He shook his head and gave me a half-smile laced with concern. Brother, he said, that lady calls 911 like she's ordering takeout. Just last month, she reported a suspicious jogger. It turned out to be the mailman on his lunch break. But the real kicker, cops always show up fast for her. I mean fast. Faster than for real emergencies. Bingo. That was the puzzle piece I'd been waiting for. Tony didn't realize it, but he had just confirmed my suspicions. Victoria Hamilton had some kind of privileged relationship with local law enforcement. That night, I logged into the secure government system using encrypted access credentials. If Victoria had any idea what I was actually doing in that drab little office, she'd probably have a heart attack. The data hit harder than I expected. Victoria Hamilton had filed 67 emergency calls in just 8 months. Her average police response time? 4 minutes. The community average? Nearly 16. Someone was absolutely giving her preferential treatment, and I intended to find out who. As I combed through deeper records, another detail caught my eye. An old mailing record listed a Linda Walker at the exact same address as Victoria's current mansion. Same house, different name, or maybe broken bar, same person. That's when it hit me: Victoria Hamilton might be hiding more than just a superiority complex. But what I uncovered next made those 67 emergency calls look like small potatoes. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen who thought they ran your whole life, go ahead and drop a comment below. The following 2 weeks felt like psychological combat, and I'm not exaggerating. Apparently, Victoria had made it her personal mission to drive me out by any means necessary. If she couldn't get me to leave quietly, she was going to make every single day unbearable. And to be fair, the woman was relentless. Each morning, I'd arrive at my office to find a fresh violation notice taped to the door. Day 1, grass height inconsistent with community policy. Lady, it's a parking lot, I don't have grass. Day 2, vehicle parked at a disruptive angle. I brought out measuring tape. My car was perfectly aligned. Day 3, unauthorized commercial activity. Apparently, carrying a clipboard makes me an entrepreneur now. But these notices were just her opening moves. Victoria launched a full-on social media smear campaign. She started posting vague but obviously targeted messages about unapproved individuals using community spaces and the need to protect neighborhood standards. She never named me directly, but the photos said it all. There was one of my car, captioned, "When neighborhood pride starts slipping, a broken bar," then another, A snapshot of my McDonald's cup. Some people just don't respect shared environments. It was like she was building a legal chassis, probably because she actually believed she could. Her tactics escalated. She began filing city reports against me for excessive electricity usage. Apparently, my laptop being plugged in for a full workday was a danger to the power grid. Then came the noise complaints. I was apparently typing too loudly. She even claimed there were suspicious odors coming from my office. Spoiler alert, it was my tuna sandwich. Watching her unravel in real time was surreal, but the scary part? She actually had influencia and she was using it to make my life harder every day. I finally understood why the other residents walked around like they were always bracing for impact. But here's the thing about psychological warfare, it's a two-way street. I started planting little reminders of my handyman poverty in places I knew would set her off. McDonald's cups, left just where her security cams would catch them. Walmart receipts, strategically placed on my desk during her routine inspections. And my car? I started parking it just a hair off center, enough to itch at her obsessive sense of order, but not enough to break any actual rule. The reaction was instant and priceless. She spent hours snapping photos of infractions, muttering under her breath about property values and neighborhood integrity like some HOA vigilante unraveling at the seams. Watching her was like seeing someone come undone one tiny thread at a time. But the real turning point came in the third week as something happened that flipped the entire situation on its head. I was working late one evening, around 7 p.m., when I overheard Victoria just outside my office. She was on the phone, but the voice she used, it was unrecognizably soft, sweet, like a sweet old lady trying to bake cookies for the neighborhood. "Hi, Rosa," she cooed. "It's Mrs. Hamilton. I'm getting concerned again about that suspicious man. Could you make sure any calls from our area are treated as a priority?" Rosa. First name basis with a 911 dispatcher. That's when it hit me, this wasn't just about fast response times. Victoria had built personal ties with the very people handling emergency calls. She didn't just game the system, she owned it. Later that night, Tony stopped by again. At this point, he was basically my local informant. "You caught that, didn't you?" he said with a half smirk. "She brings Rosa fresh baked cookies every month," he added. "Always goes on about safety and being a concerned neighbor. Rosa thinks she's just this harmless old lady looking out for the block." The puzzle pieces were finally falling into place. Victoria wasn't just manipulating the emergency system, she had turned the dispatchers into unwitting accomplices by presenting herself as the guardian angel of Maplewood. That night, I decided it was time to dive deeper into her past, and what I uncovered was nothing short of shocking. The name Linda Walker had shown up more than once in old documents tied to Victoria's current property. Turns out, Linda Walker was Victoria Hamilton. I pulled birth certificates, old tax records, employment history. It was all there. Linda Walker had been a single mom scraping by in public housing, juggling multiple minimum wage jobs just to feed her kid. Then, in 2005, she married Harold Hamilton, a wealthy widower more than 30 years her senior. 2 years later, Harold passed away, leaving everything to his young wife. Linda Walker disappeared the moment Harold died. From those ashes, Victoria Hamilton emerged. But the most surreal discovery? Her old address. Linda's last listed residence was a trailer in Section C, Lot 47, at the exact trailer park that was torn down to build a luxury shopping center. Victoria had literally constructed her dream mansion over the rubble of her old life. She tried to erase Linda Walker entirely, but the past isn't so easily buried. It finds ways to rise back up, especially when someone like me shows up, carrying all the same scars she tried to pretend she never had. No wonder my ramen wrappers and Walmart receipts rattled her so badly. To her, I wasn't just some broke guy in her spacey, I was the ghost of her old life, walking and breathing in front of her. The next morning, I got my first real glimpse of just how fractured Victoria's mind had become. I arrived a little earlier than usual and heard voices inside the office. The door was cracked open. She was standing in front of the mirror, talking to herself like she was rehearsing for a role she didn't believe in anymore. "I am Victoria Hamilton," she repeated like a chant. "I live at 1247 Maple Drive." I drive a Mercedes. I am not Linda Walker. Linda Walker doesn't exist. Linda Walker was poor. I am not poor. The desperation in her tone was heartbreaking. This wasn't just about power or appearance, it was about survival. Her identity was built on denying everything she used to be, and my presence was tearing holes in that illusion. By the end of that week, something had changed in the air. Tony had been quietly organizing what he called the Resistencia residents who were tired of being ruled by fear and fines. There was Mrs. Cooper, an older woman who'd been fined $300 for a garden gnome her late husband gave her. There was a young couple constantly harassed because Victoria claimed their frequent food deliveries violated some made-up community rule. A single mother had been threatened with eviction because her kids' bicycles were visible from the street. These people had been quietly suffering for years, but watching someone finally push back gave them courage. Sophie, the HOA secretary, became an unlikely ally. She was soft-spoken and always kept to herself, but turns out, she'd been documenting Victoria's abuse for 2 whole years. I've been waiting for someone brave enough to confront her, she told me one evening. I have Itala emails, recordings, even financial irregularities. I just needed someone who could actually do something with it. She had no idea I wasn't just some underpaid handyman. I had the actual authority to shut Victoria down for good. But the timing had to be perfect. Victoria thought she was about to destroy me, the broke outsider who didn't belong. What she didn't realize was that I had been building a case against her since day one, recording every outburst, every fake report, every violation of power. And to my readers at Anadrama Nest, stay tuned, because what I found out about Victoria's real identity, that's the kind of twist that turns everything upside down. Theories started flying in from everywhere, especially from the readers over at Anadrama Nest. And honestly, they were spot on. The mental strain was clearly eating away at Victoria. You could see it in her every move. Her morning inspections grew more obsessive and invasive. She started showing up as early as 6:30 a.m., strutting through the community center like a correctional officer on a power trip, snapping photos of the tiniest imperfections. She was absolutely consumed with collecting evidence against me, trying to piece together what she likely believed was an airtight case to get me kicked out. But what she didn't realize was that every picture she took, every violation she filed, every rant-filled phone call was helping me build my case against her. The irony? It was poetic. Like watching someone dig their own grave while thinking they were planting a rose garden. By the 4th week, her behavior had become so unhinged that even her most loyal followers were beginning to second-guess her judgment. She started imposing bizarre new rules overnight. No food or drinks allowed in shared spaces. No unattended personal belongings. Mandatory sign-in sheets for community center access. And it wasn't just me she was targeting anymore. Everyone was being affected. I watched longtime residents stumble through her sudden policy shifts, trying to keep up. Confusion turned to frustration. Resentment began to simmer. Victoria was so obsessed with keeping tabs on me that she lost sight of one important rule. Dictators always forget that if you push people too far, eventually they push back. Tension in Maplewood was reaching a breaking point. That's when I overheard another one of her private phone calls. This one wasn't a whispered self-affirmation in the mirror. She was on the line with Rosa again, but this time her tone was raw, desperate, strained, like she knew the walls were closing in. "Rosa, sweetheart," she said, her voice syrupy with manipulation. "You don't understand how serious this is getting. This Mana, he's doing surveillance. He's tracking patterns, bringing in suspicious equipment. I've documented everything. I will be calling, and I need it handled urgently." The way she weaponized that fake concern made my skin crawl. That evening, Tony came by again, visibly disturbed. He'd been hearing stories from neighbors about Victoria's latest community outreach. Apparently, she'd started going door to door, warning residents about so-called security threats. She was recruiting neighbors to act as watchmen, fueling a wave of paranoia. Mrs. Cooper had been advised to keep an eye out for strangers near the kids' playground. The young couple, told to report any unfamiliar cars in the area. The single mother, asked to keep notes on irregular behavior. She was turning the neighborhood into a web of paranoia, her own private surveillance network. Everyone was becoming her eyes and ears, watching each other through a lens of suspicion. But what Sophie discovered next was even more disturbing. Digging through HOA financial records, she uncovered a pattern of shady transactions and money labeled for security enhancements that had mysteriously disappeared. Over the last 2 years, $18,000 had quietly vanished. Victoria had funneled that money through a series of sketchy purchases, consulting fees, equipment orders, miscellaneous charges. None of it matched any real upgrades to the community's safety. The board had signed off on every single expense, rubber-stamped and unchallenged. It wasn't just 911 she was abusing, she was stealing from the very people she claimed to protect, funding her delusions with their money. Then I found the final piece of the puzzle: the older documents that painted the full picture of how Linda Walker became Victoria Hamilton. It read like a psychological thriller, equal parts tragic and calculated. Linda Walker married Harold Hamilton in December 2005, just 3 months after they met at a charity event for low-income families. Harold, an aging widower with declining health, was completely taken in by her. She seemed gentle, caring, sincere. They were married for 26 months before Harold died of a heart attack. He left everything to his devoted young wife, and that was the end of Linda Walker. Within 6 months of Harold's death, she legally changed her name to Victoria Hamilton. She sold the old trailer in Section C and used the life insurance payout to buy her mansion on Maple Drive. She erased everything: photos, documents, even her own social security number, changed through a program meant to protect domestic violence survivors. She claimed she was escaping an abusive relationship. In a way, she wasn't lying. She was running from her past, from poverty. Victoria Hamilton wasn't just someone who reinvented herself, she was someone who deleted herself. What emerged from that process was a woman driven by fear and shame, a person who had been so scarred by poverty that she created an entirely new identity to survive. It was heartbreaking and terrifying. This wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. Victoria Hamilton was a woman at war with her own pasta, and everyone around her was just collateral damage. Every luxury item she flaunted, every regulation she pushed, every condescending glance she cast, it was all part of a carefully curated act meant to convince herself that Linda Walker was long gone. But trauma doesn't just disappear like that. You can't bury emotional scars under wealth, and no set of rules can rewrite your past. All the pain, the shame, the sense of powerlessness, it still existed, just buried beneath designer outfits and the illusion of community power. And I, unknowingly, had become the trigger. Every time I sat in that office, sipping from a McDonald's cup and wearing my worn-out Walmart clothes, I became a mirror to her former self. I reminded her of the life she'd worked so hard to erase. No wonder she wanted me out. I represented everything she'd clawed her way out of. But instead of facing her inner demons, she chose to unleash them. She twisted systems meant to protect into tools of control. The 911 calls, the intimidation tactics, the shady money trails, it was all a part of her increasingly fragile grip on a fantasy that was unraveling fast. She had built her identity in direct opposition to Linda Walker, and now, my mere presence was threatening to tear that illusion apart. By the end of the 4th week, Victoria issued a notice for what she called a community emergency safety meeting. The flyer left no doubt that this wasn't going to be a standard HOA discussion. This was a trial by fire, a public spectacle, with me at the center of it. The headline read, "Protecting our community from infiltration," but the real purpose? To publicly demand I leave the office, and when I didn't complete as she fully expected, she'd call 911 to have me removed in front of everyone. This was to be her grand moment, her demonstration of absolute control, her declaration that Victoria Hamilton ruled over Maplewood without question. What she wrote in her personal journal that night made it clear just how far gone she was. "Tomorrow, I eliminate the threat. I'll order him to leave publicly. When he refuses and he will, I'll call 911. They'll see I'm protecting the community from people like Linda Walker, like I used to be, but I'm not her anymore." She was ready to summon emergency services on someone who had done nothing but remind her of who she once was. The level of delusion was staggering, but for me, it was the final piece of the puzzle. Her unraveling had become the final proof I needed. Victoria Hamilton was about to self-destruct, and I had a front row seat. What she didn't know was that Marcus had been planning his own counter-strike, and it would bring her entire world crashing down. Let us know in the comments, have you ever seen someone's fake identity fall apart just before the big reveal? The night before the meeting, sleep barely came to me, not from nervousness but from anticipation. I wasn't afraid. I knew exactly how things would unfold. After weeks of watching her torment others, misuse emergency services, and funnel money from her own neighbors, justice was finally on the way. I had months' worth of evidence. I documented every lie, every abuse, every manipulation. She thought she was cornering me, but in reality, she was walking straight into the trap I'd been building since the day I got to Maplewood. By 7:30 that evening, the community center was packed. Tony leaned over and whispered it was the biggest turnout in HOA history, 24 residents in total. Most of them looked uneasy, stiff, unsure of what they'd just walked into. Victoria took her place at the front of the room like a judge presiding over court. She'd even brought a gavel. Behind her stood a large display board labeled "Protecting Our Community Values." She wore her flashiest designer outfit, a power suit probably worth more than a month's rent for some of the attendees. She wanted control. She wanted spectacle. Her presentation, a twisted work of delusion masquerading as public service. For 20 straight minutes, she laid out my crimes. She showed slides of my car claiming it didn't meet HOA vehicle standards, photos of me eating fast food a proof, she said, of disrespect for shared spaces, security footage showing me staying late on unauthorized use of community facilities. To her, I wasn't just a new licensee, I was a threat, a suspected spy. She had genuinely convinced herself that my laptop, clipboard, and note-taking habit meant I was conducting a covert operation. I've tried reasoning with this man, she exclaimed, her voice rising with every sentence. I've warned him, but he refuses to respect what we've built here. His presence threatens our very way of life. It was pure irony. The woman who had built her life on lies was now accusing me of deception. And I just sat in the back row, calm, taking notes. Every so often I'd nod, as if I was genuinely intrigued by her conspiracy theory presentation. Around me, residents kept sneaking glances, confused by how composed I looked while being accused of espionage in a suburban HOA meeting. They had no idea what was coming. If they did, they'd have been a lot less confident in siding with Victoria. Sophie made a brave attempt to speak up for me. Victoria, he hasn't done anything wrong, she said. But Victoria shut her down instantly. Sophie, you're too naive to understand real security threats, she snapped. Then Tony tried to bring some logic into the situation, but he barely got a sentence out before she cut him off too. Tony, your judgment has always been a broken bar, questionable. That's when things started to shift. Mrs. Cooper leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, there was something official looking about that laptop. Someone else chimed in, didn't you see him talking to someone in a police cruiser yesterday? The whispers were gaining momentum. The room was slowly beginning to realize that I might not be who Victoria had painted me to be, but Victoria either didn't notice or didn't care. She was completely locked into the climax of her performance, too focused on her big finale to see the growing doubt spreading through the crowd. After she finished her presentation, she stood tall, arm outstretched, pointing at me like a judge handing down a sentence. Based on the evidence I've presented, she declared with dramatic flair, I am ordering this individual to vacate the community office, immediately. Leave now. This was the moment she had worked toward, her final display of control, her ultimate effort to eliminate the one thing that could unravel her tightly wound illusion of authority. I met her eyes and calmly replied, I have a valid rental agreement, I'm not going anywhere. And just like that, the show fell apart. Victoria's expression turned from triumphant to enraged in seconds. Her face flushed, cycling through multiple shades of red, her voice cracking from fury. I am the HOA president, she screamed, loud enough that people in the parking lot probably heard her. You will leave when I say so. I simply repeated myself, even more composed than before. Ma'am, I'm not leaving. This is my lawful workspace. It was a perfect contrast to her losing all composure while I remained steady and unbothered. The entire room could feel the tension shift. This wasn't just an HOA disagreement anymore. This was something bigger. Some residents looked visibly unsettled. A few started fidgeting in their seats. Others pulled out their phone as instinctively sensing that something major was about to happen. Victoria stood trembling, her carefully built Tilda Section 8 falling apart right there in front of everyone. She was unraveling in real time, faced with the first person who had ever dared to hold his ground against her threats. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. Now completely unhinged, she shouted, "Since you refuse to leave the community office as ordered by the HOA president, I have no choice but to call the authorities." She whipped out her phone like she was pulling a weapon, dramatically dialing 911 and putting the call on speaker for everyone to hear. This was at the very moment Victoria Hamilton would implode under the weight of her own pride. 911, she said breathlessly, her voice shaking as though not from fear, but from barely masked hysteria. "This is Victoria Hamilton, president of the Maplewood HOA. I need police assistance right away," she continued. "There's a man in our community office. He's been trespassing for weeks, and now he's directly refusing an order to leave. I'm worried he might become violent." It was a full-blown performance worthy of a dramatic award. You could tell she'd practiced that speech in the mirror for days. She went on, gesturing at me with shaking hands, whispering outlandish claims about how I'd been photographing kids and acting suspicious. She even managed to fall into her seat like a fainting heroine in a soap opera, gasping out, "I can't. This is just too much stress." Half the room had their phones raised, recording every second. The other half looked deeply uncomfortable. Sophie was shaking her head, clearly disgusted. Tony muttered something under his breath that I'm sure wasn't a compliment. Meanwhile, I sat quietly, waiting. The best part hadn't even started yet. Just 6 minutes later, the door opened. 2 officers arrived, led by Chief Reyes. Victoria rushed toward them like she was starring in a dramatic rescue scene, nearly flinging herself at their feet. "Chief Reyes, thank goodness you're here," she wailed. "That man has been terrorizing us for weeks. I want him arrested immediately for trespassing and refusing to comply." The chief scanned the room, visibly puzzled by the supposed emergency. The sight of a group of suburban residents sitting tensely in folding chairs didn't exactly scream danger. Then his eyes landed on me, still sitting quietly in the back. I saw the exact second recognition hit him. His entire posture changed. This was the moment Victoria had fantasized about for weeks, her shining moment of triumph, where she would publicly crush the man who dared challenge her. She'd finally called the police on the so-called handyman she believed was beneath her. Only problem? I wasn't a handyman, and I definitely wasn't powerless. I stood up slowly, made direct eye contact with Chief Reyes, and said in a steady, authoritative tone, "Chief Reyes, thank you for responding. I'm Inspector Marcus Blake from the State Police. I specialize in investigating 911 misuse." Mrs. Hamilton just made a false emergency report in front of all these witnesses. You could have heard a pin drop. The silence was instant and absolute. Chief Reyes's face went ghost white. His mouth dropped open as the weight of my words sank in. But the real shock wasn't just who I was, it was the fact that everything had been part of a long setup to expose Victoria's lies. And that setup was now paying off. Let us know in the comments, have you ever seen someone's entire fake life unravel in a single moment? The look on Victoria's face was unforgettable. Her mouth opened and closed like she couldn't figure out how to breathe. For about 10 seconds, she just stood there, frozen, her brain clearly refusing to process what had just happened. Her arms slowly lowered, her body sagged. Then she began making short, frantic gasps, like someone realizing they were awake in a nightmare they couldn't escape. Her entire fabricated world had just crumbled. And I won't Leah, after seeing her bully so many innocent people, it felt incredibly satisfying to watch karma deliver the bill. Meanwhile, Chief Reyes looked like he wished he could melt into the floor. "Yeah, broken bar, Inspector Blake," he stammered. "Sir, yeah, I didn't know a broken bar. I'm so sorry." The poor guy was sweating bullets, probably starting to realize his officers had been pulled into a web of lies for months. I kept my voice firm, professional, and crystal clear so no one in the room could miss a word. "Mrs. Hamilton has placed 67 false emergency calls to 911 over the past 8 months. She's been bribing dispatcher Rosa with baked goods and little gifts for special treatment." "Chief, Please place Mrs. Hamilton under arrest for filing a false police report." That's when Victoria finally snapped back into action, and what a spectacle it was. "No!" she shrieked, so loudly I'm sure people down the block heard it. "This is absurd. I'm Victoria Hamilton. I own a mansion. You can't arrest me. He's just some broke nobody like I used to own." "No, I'm not Linda Walker. I'm Victoria Hamilton." And there it was. In one hysterical outburst, she exposed her entire secret. She wasn't who she claimed to be. She had just confessed to living under a false identity in front of 24 witnesses and at least 6 smartphone cameras. She had ruined herself, with nothing but her own panicked voice. That's when Tony stood up, grinning like he'd been waiting 20 years for this moment. "Linda Walker," he said, shaking his head with a smirk. "I remember you. Trailer Park, Section C, Lot 47. I was wondering when you'd finally mess up." The entire room erupted into stunned whispers and gasps. Their queen bee had just been exposed as a fraud. Meanwhile, Sophie had her phone up, live streaming the whole thing like she was calling a play-by-play of a championship game. "Y'all, our HOA Karen just called 911 a broken bar on a state inspector. You can't make this up." As Chief Reyes began reading Victoria her rights, she spiraled completely out of control, cycling through denial, bargaining, and total meltdown in less than 2 minutes. "You don't get it?" she begged, her voice reaching a high-pitched, desperate whine. "I've poured my life into this community. I've preserved home values. I've kept everything running perfectly. But nobody was buying the performance anymore." The mask had slipped, and all that was left was a frightened, desperate woman wearing designer brands and clutching at a crumbling fantasy. She was handcuffed and led away while the same neighbors she once ruled over watched from their porches, some even cheering as she was taken. And the very next day, investigators kicked off a full-blown investigation, and what they uncovered was even more jaw-dropping than anyone had imagined. Victoria's mansion was raided, and officials found $18,000 in cash stashed in her bedroom, money siphoned from HODUs over the last 2 years. But it didn't stop there. Hidden away in the attic was something she had called the Linda Walker Memorial Box. Inside were old welfare cards, food stamps, eviction notices, and faded photographs from her trailer park days. It was like discovering the remnants of a person she had tried to erase, buried under designer bags and a fake name. And then came Rose's confession, perhaps the most heartbreaking moment of all. A struggling young dispatcher, single mom, working multiple shifts just to keep food on the table. Rosa, the young dispatcher Victoria had manipulated, truly believed she was helping a kind-hearted old woman who cared about her neighborhood. "She always seemed so sweet," Rosa sobbed during her interview with investigators. "She brought cookies for my kids' birthdays, sent holiday cards, and asked how my mom was doing. I thought she just cared about safety." It was gut-wrenching to hear. Victoria had weaponized Rose's kindness, turning her into an unwilling accomplice in her abuse of emergency services. Once the truth was out, the neighborhood's reaction was swift and overwhelming. It was like watching a volcano erupt after years of pressure. Residents who had lived in fear under Victoria's rule finally spoke out. Mrs. Cooper told the news that Victoria had fined her $300 for placing a garden gnome on her lawn, a sentimental gift from her late husband. She'd called it a violation of aesthetic standards. A young mother, Jessica, shared how Victoria had dialed 911 on their babysitter not once, not twice, but 3 times, each time accusing her of suspicious behavior when all the poor girl had done was study on the porch after putting the kids to bed. She was a college student trying to pay for textbooks. And the stories didn't stop. One after another, neighbors came forward with tales of fines, false accusations, threats, and petty enforcement that had made their lives miserable. Tony, whose earlier comment had gone viral, gave a news interview that summed up the community's mood perfectly. "I've lived here 2 decades, he said, shaking his head. "I've watched that woman ruin people's lives with fake emergencies and her obsession with power. Finally, someone with real authority did something about it." You could hear the years of frustration and vindication in his voice. And honestly, who could blame him? For too long, the neighborhood had been under siege, not by a criminal gang, but by one woman's obsession with control. And now, for the first time, People could walk the streets without the fear of being watched or targeted. You could see the relief on their faces, like a heavy weight had finally lifted. Meanwhile, Victoria was sitting in county jail making one desperate phone call after another, and each one was more tragic than the last, proof that she still hadn't accepted what was happening. She phoned Rosa first, yelling, "I helped your family, I brought cookies." Rosa hung up immediately. Then she tried Sophie. "You're just jealous of my success," she shrieked into the phone. Sophie blocked the number. Finally, she called her lawyer, ranting, "This is harassment. They're targeting me because I'm successful." Even from behind bars, she couldn't admit the truth that her so-called success was built entirely on lies, manipulation, and stolen money. She was still clinging to her fantasy. As the investigation deepened, more disturbing facts came to light. It turned out Victoria's crimes stretched far beyond home mismanagement. This was full-scale fraud. She had filed fake tax returns for years, listing bogus expenses for community security that were actually personal shopping sprees. She had taken out loans using the HOA's name, defaulting on them when she couldn't keep up the scam. And unbelievably, she'd even been charging other neighborhoods consultation fees to teach them her twisted management style, basically selling her toxic control tactics as best practices. Victoria had turned her narcissism into a business plan, but the most horrifying part, the breakdown of her 911 call history. Investigators discovered a sickening pattern. Over 89% of her emergency reports involved either people of color, service workers, or residents she assumed were lower income. She had called the police on a black mailman for loitering when he was just taking a water break. She had reported a Latino landscaping crew for suspicious behavior because they were playing music while trimming hedges. She even filed a complaint about potential child endangerment after seeing neighborhood kids playing in their own backyard without a visible adult nearby. Victoria Hamilton wasn't just a Karen. She was a racist Karen with a cell phone and an illusion of power. The online reaction was immediate and brutal. Social media exploded. Hashtags about her arrest trended across multiple platforms. Victoria's mugshot was instantly turned into memes, reaction videos, and parody content. One video titled "Karen Calls 911 on Her Boss" hit 4 million views overnight. People from across the country were stitching together commentary, roasting her downfall, and sharing their own experiences with neighborhood tyrants like her. Some were calling it the most satisfying downfall of a Karen the internet had ever witnessed, and honestly, they weren't wrong. Real justice had finally landed, and everyone was watching. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Victoria's actions were just one part of a much deeper, more troubling pattern. Anna Dramanesque community. What's the worst case of power abuse you've seen in your own neighborhood? The court proceedings were exactly what you'd hope for in a case like these, and even more dramatic than expected. Victoria had managed to hire the priciest attorney she could find, though her assets were frozen by then, so it didn't mean much. The poor man tried to cast her as simply an overly passionate community protector, but it was a lost cause. The evidence spoke louder than any defense. 67 fake emergency calls, $18,000 in stolen neighborhood funds, years of targeted harassment, tax fraud, and enough civil rights complaints to overwhelm any legal team. Judge Martinez didn't hold back during sentencing. Staring right at Victoria, he declared, "Mrs. Hamilton, you've systematically betrayed every ounce of trust your neighbors placed in you. You misused emergency services, stole from your community, and fostered an environment of fear and control that has no place in a free society." Her sentence, 12 months in county jail, 3 years of probation, $45,000 in combined fines and restitution, 600 hours of community service. But the real sting was in where she'd be doing that service. At the Maplewood Community Center, the very place she once treated like her private kingdom. The irony couldn't have been more perfect. The same floor she had once paraded across like a self-appointed queen, she now had to scrub them clean. On her first day, it felt like a neighborhood block party. Word had spread about when she'd start, and people just happened to stroll by the center at just the right time to catch a glimpse. There she was, Victoria Hamilton in an orange safety vest over a county-issued jumpsuit, pushing a mop bucket like a low-budget janitor in a bad sitcom. The image was almost too poetic to be real. "Tony, ever the local legend, couldn't resist. "Morning, Linda," he called out with mock cheer through the window. "Floors look good today." "Don't forget the spot where your throne used to be," Victoria muttered. "My name is Victoria Broken Bar," barely loud enough to hear. Tony just grinned. "Nah, your name's whatever the county says it is now." Karma has a funny way of working, and not just by punishing the guilty, but by giving their victims a chance to reclaim what was taken from them. Sophie was unanimously elected as the new HOA president at 23 votes to none, the most decisive result in Maplewood's history. Her first move, reversing every arbitrary and discriminatory fine Victoria had ever handed out, returning over $12,000 to residents. Mrs. Cooper got her $300 refund and celebrated by buying 2 more garden gnomes. She proudly set them in her yard, complete with a sign, "Welcome to the free garden gnome zone." The young couple, previously harassed over takeout deliveries, started a neighborhood food share initiative. The single mom whose kids' bikes were banned? She organized Saturday group rides for all the children in the neighborhood. Maplewood began to flourish. With Victoria out of the picture, the neighborhood turned into the kind of community it was always meant to be. Sophie launched open book financial reporting, a monthly statements available to everyone, and quarterly town halls where residents could ask questions directly about HOA spending. All of Victoria's nonsense rules were scrapped one by one. A new Good Neighbor Fund was created from the recovered money to help any families struggling with bills or emergencies. The community center was reopened with full access at 24/7 for residents to use however they pleased. Birthday parties, yoga classes, community meetings. It became the beating heart of Maplewood again. Property values jumped by 28% within 8 months. Real estate agents even started marketing Maplewood as a Karen-free zone. The waiting list for new homes was filled with people eager to move into what had become the most inclusive neighborhood in the area. The contrast to Victoria's fear-based rule was stark. Where she'd used fear, Sophie fostered trust, and the results spoke for themselves. One of the most meaningful redemption arcs came from Rosa, the dispatcher Victoria had manipulated. After initially being suspended, Rosa fully cooperated with the investigation and helped overhaul their internal systems. Not only was she cleared of wrongdoing, she was eventually promoted to 911 training supervisor. She developed new training programs that taught emergency operators how to detect and resist emotional manipulation. Her experience became a core case study used in statewide training. "I learned the hard way that even kindness can be exploited," Rosa told one group of new recruits. "Now, I follow every rule by the book, no exceptions. No favors." Cookies don't override protocol. But the change didn't stop at Maplewood. Victoria's case became a catalyst for statewide reform. A full audit of emergency call abuse revealed 15 other neighborhoods with similar issues. New oversight rules were put into place. Every high-priority call now had to be properly documented and justified. Community liaison programs were launched to help bridge the gap between residents and emergency services. In an unexpected way, Victoria's misdeeds sparked the most sweeping emergency response reforms the state had ever seen. I quietly gathered up my handyman gear, still worn and humbly, and prepared to leave Maplewood just as I had arrived, unnoticed. No ceremonies, no thank you speeches, no public recognition for helping bring down Victoria's little empire. That's the nature of this kind of work: collect the facts, document the wrongdoing, help justice find its mark, a broken bar, and then vanish into the next role, the next mission. Most people in Maplewood would never truly know how deep the investigation ran, or just how close they came to losing their community for good. And honestly, that was fine with me. In my final report, I marked the Maplewood case as a full success. Subject: Victoria Hamilton, aka Linda Walker, an ideal example of trauma-fueled authority misuse, resulting in targeted harassment, financial fraud, and abuse of emergency services. Community response overwhelmingly positive once facts are disclosed. Recommend replication of investigative method for broader state application. Beneath all the formal phrasing, though, I felt real pride. We'd stopped a criminal, freed a neighborhood, and helped spark changes that would prevent the same abuse from repeating elsewhere. A year later, An update from Maplewood landed in my inbox and it made me grin. The community had been featured in State magazine as a model of democratic transformation. How one HOA rebuilt after tyranny, a headline that said it all. Not a single abuse of 911 services had been reported in over 12 months. Their new Unity Day celebration drew crowds from across the region. They'd even renamed the community center after the woman who documented everything and helped rebuild it all, the Sophie Chang Democracy Center. Maplewood had become home to families from over a dozen different nations, now recognized as one of the most inclusive and welcoming communities in the county. And as for Victoria, she served her time, was now working retail at a second-hand shop, fitting for someone who once belittled anyone without wealth. She lived in a tiny studio near the courthouse, kept her head down for probation check-ins, and had vanished completely from social media after going viral for all the wrong reasons. Sometimes, neighbors caught sight of her at the local grocery store paying in cash, keeping her head low, darting out before anyone could engage. The woman who once demanded to be treated like royalty now couldn't bear being seen. Meanwhile, Tony had become a beloved figure in the neighborhood, a quiet leader, a mentor to new families. He hosted weekly Coffee with Tony chats to help resolve disputes. His most quoted line now adorned the welcome sign. True strength in a community comes from lifting each other up and not tearing each other down. Sophie thrived as HOA president. Her monthly newsletter, Building Inclusive Communities, gained over 8,000 subscribers across the country. She even got engaged to a civil rights attorney she'd met at an activism summit. Their honeymoon plans, visiting neighborhoods facing challenges like the ones Maplewood had conquered. Just as I was finishing the last bit of paperwork and loading up for my next destination, my phone buzzed. Caller ID, a familiar area code. Inspector Blake, the voice said. We've got an HOA president over in Riverside logging 73 calls about sketchy food trucks and unacceptable lawn decorations. Residents are saying it feels like targeted harassment and biased enforcement. Ring any bells? I glanced at my Civica already packed with my well-worn handyman disguise. Fire up the Honda, I replied. Time to meet another Karen, because the great thing about justice, it travels well. Victoria Hamilton's story had reached its end. But somewhere in Riverside, another community was waiting, trapped under their own version of control, waiting for someone to help them breathe again. And I'd be there, clipboard ready, fast food cup on the dash, prepared to remind yet another self-declared tyrant that real power comes from those who earn it, not those who grab it. When you build your world on lies and abuse authority for personal gain, karma will come knocking. Maplewood proved that even the most toxic leaders can be brought down when good people unite. If this story struck a chord with you, go ahead and smash the like button, and let the Drama Nest community know your thoughts. I'm Marcusa and I'll see you in the next investigation. Until then, don't back down from the Karens in your life. That escalated fast. Classic Drama Nest. Like, share and hit the next video if you're ready for more.